Thank you, Todd. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Bason. I'm the Executive Director with the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. And I would just like to start off my testimony today by thanking members of Council, Mr. President, for putting this ordinance forward. This is a very important ordinance for water quality and habitat and our way of life in Sussex County. And I know it took a lot of work to get it to this point, and we're grateful for that. My presentation today will include a review of the Inland Bay's Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan as it pertains to this ordinance. Then I want to talk about the health of our resources that we have today, our waters, how they're doing, our wetlands, how they're doing. I want to review the purposes and functions of buffers that are in the ordinance, because that's very important to what we're talking about, and then provide you with an assessment of the achievements of the ordinance and its effectiveness. I also want to talk about requested amendments to the ordinance from the center. And yesterday afternoon, I provided to Todd and Robin a packet of information from the center, which includes a marked up copy of the ordinance that we would like to see. And so the specifics are in that. I'm not going to talk about everything that's in that markup, but just focus on the major amendments that we're requesting. A little bit about myself before I get going. I am a biologist. I have 23 years of experience, and it revolves around wetlands and estuaries, their protection and their management. I work for the United States Army Corps of Engineers in the wetlands section, and I've studied the wetlands of the Nanticoke River watershed and the Inland Bays watershed. This here is our management plan. This is the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for the Inland Bays, and it was revised and reapproved just last year. The purpose of this plan is to provide a roadmap for reducing the pollution to the inland bays and restoring its water quality and its habitat, oyster reefs, bay grass meadows, bays, salt marshes. There's 67 actions in the plan focused on that, also including public education and engagement and mitigating and adapting to flooding and climate change. The county is one of 7 signatories to this plan. And when we were putting together this revision, I think it's important to note that we surveyed the public, and over 500 responses were provided, and 60% of those people identified runoff from developments as the biggest threat to the inland bays. So buffers have been in our management plan for a long time, and in fact in 1995 the original management plan for the inland bays was an action in there to extend what they called at the time the setback to 300 feet. It was in the 2012 addendum, which was the updated plan, and here it sits. We're still here with it, and it's an important part of the plan. Sussex is the lead on the action for better buffers in the bays. This is a great example of a buffer that I'd like to orient you all to. This is a development called the Retreat, and it's on Love Creek, and so that's the creek that you're looking at there. It's a great example of a really highly functioning buffer. In places, the buffer is actually 300 feet wide. It's all forested. There's some places where it's about 100 feet wide, and it does a wonderful job of providing a physical barrier to Love Creek. It provides wonderful wildlife habitat, and actually when you walk down in that buffer, you feel like you're going into a forest. You are immersed in the forest, and there's wildlife all over the place. And the quality of the water in Love Creek here reflects that. It is one of the last places in the entire inland bays that you actually have underwater bay grasses growing. That's where the green writing, and that's all bay grasses in there, covers the bottom. And I've been snorkeling out there. When you go in those bay grasses, you know what's in those bay grasses? Crabs. Lots and lots of crabs, little baby fish. The water is relatively clear out there. And that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to protect those areas and bring back those bay grasses. You need clean water to do that. One of the reasons why that's the only place basically left with bay grasses is because part of it's because that buffer's there. Forests next to the water protect the estuary, and they provide really good conditions. Now, the interesting story behind that buffer is the people in the area on Love Creek, when they heard that development was going in, they said, hey, we're concerned. We want to keep this water quality. Can you all put in a big buffer on that neighborhood? And they worked with the developers, and in the end, they did get a much wider buffer than what's required. It's required a 50-foot buffer, but in places that's 300 feet. My point is here is that people around the waterways, they care about their local creek that they swim in, that they fish in and kayak, and they care about its condition. And I want to return to that point later on in my presentation when we're talking about these buffer options, okay? And maybe you can see where I'm going with that. Another thing to point out about this buffer, tells a great story, is that I believe, for the most part, the vast majority of cases, if there is a forested buffer out there, mostly what you see is when the project comes in, that buffer is preserved, the forest remains. I think most people do the right thing. And in fact, there's a great example right across that creek. I think it was a Shell Brothers development. They kept the buffer too. It was forested, they kept it. And in fact, in that development, it's 100 feet in some places. I think most of the time the forest is really protected. I think there are a few cases where the forest is chopped right down and then the development application is submitted, which is the core problem that we're talking about today. Sometimes that happens, but I think most of the time this is the ordinance is followed that we at least have today. Now, if we're talking about incentives, in my mind, the incentives in Section G, they're not really incentives for what we're talking about with this ordinance. Here's where we should be thinking about incentives. We raise the bar for better protection, and then if a developer goes above and beyond that, that's where the incentives come in. This is the type of stuff you can get with incentives.
What kind of incentive would you go to, Chris, in a case like that?
Well, in the work group, brought up the topic of increased density. I know that is a hot topic. I think that might be outside of my wheelhouse. But there could be other things. Cash. Maybe there's a way to work with the state or other conservation organizations to get funds. I can tell you that buffer, whether or not it is in the developed landscape or the undeveloped landscape, is highly functioning. And the bay grasses are the proof in the pudding. At the center, our job is to work with you guys, to work with DENREC, with the Department of Agriculture, with everybody to restore the quality of the water in the bays. The main problem that we have right now is too many nutrients. And this is a concept of where we're going, where we're at right now. Most of our waters don't meet water quality standards. There's a bunch of algae in the water. The light can't get to the bottom. We've got a lot of seaweeds in some places. And what we have is on the left in a lot of places. What we need to do is get the nutrients out so the light can hit the bottom, allow those bay grasses to grow, and really work on restoring these habitats, protecting our wetlands, protecting our forests near the water. And this is what we're shooting for. That's our restoration target. We've had a lot of success. We've got all the point sources out of the bays. There were 13 originally in the early 90s. All the point sources of wastewater, they come out. The atmospheric nitrogen loads in the rain, that's come down. We've met our goal for that. But where we struggle and where we're all working towards now is to reduce the non-point sources of nutrients. That's the stuff coming from the farm fields, from the runoff from the streets. It's coming from a lot of different places. And what this graph shows is the non-point loads of nitrogen coming from the watershed into Indian River Bay in pounds per day. The goal there is the healthy level, what we want to get down to. And as you can see, that for decades, we have not been able to move the needle on that, and we are still way high. My point in showing you this is that we need to be taking increased action to control pollution, and buffers can help with that. Better buffers can help. What is concerning for water quality is what is shown by this graph. Now there's a trend. And that is the trend in the wrong direction. This is for the loads of phosphorus to Little Assaulman Bay. That's the bay that I mostly recreate on. It's a beautiful bay, and it's a success story. And I think Doug could confirm this. Over time, we've seen Little Assaulman Bay clean up. The water's gotten clearer, and there's even bay grasses coming back in Little Assaulman Bay. Everybody's seen it, and they know it, and they say, I see it's getting better. But this is going in the wrong direction. It means that we have to take action. It's not just us. This is a fairly complicated chart. It's from the United States Geological Survey. But over in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in our neck of the woods, if you see Delmarva down there, a little bit cut off here for their watershed, but the orange circles show increasing loads of nutrients in the streams that are measured going into the bay. And this is recent changes, 2009 to 2018. 3 out of 4 stations, nitrogen load is going up. 4 out of 4 stations, phosphorus load is going up. Not exactly sure why, but it's coming from multiple sources. I'm painting the picture of the water quality challenges that we are facing.
What are some of those sources?
Agriculture, development, increased precipitation, driving more sediment into the bays, changes in how the nutrients are moving through the aquifers. But as a scientist, I can't tell you we know exactly what's going on, but what we're seeing in our area is happening over there too. And this is the result of these nutrient loads. This is Indian River. This is our river, right? Very important water body, highly ecologically important. And this is a brown tide. This is what you call, they got red tides in Florida. Well, we get brown tides here. It's a mahogany tide. And it's just thick algae in that waterway. This is in the summer. And the effect of that is that it affects the oxygen in the river that the crabs need to survive. The crabs we catch and we eat, our fish. All the little baby fish that go up to the river to grow, they are affected by that because the algae produces oxygen in the day, and we see where that oxygen level is going real high in the blue there. All the algae at night, they respire, and they use up the oxygen, and it slams down to zero oxygen right here on the bottom of the river. And it does this over time. It can stay down long. There's zero oxygen. The fish can't breathe. And in fact, when we measured this, I think this is 2020, something like that, there was a fish kill out there. 2,000 menhaden died. And that's common. That's what we're seeing in our Indian River. And that's not where we need to be. In fact, unfortunately, we set a record last year in the total inland bays for the number of fish kills that we had. Most of it was due to low dissolved oxygen from pollution. There was 15 recorded kills. Highest we've seen since we started measuring in 1985. So I want to shift gears and talk about land use changes. Land use matters because forests matter. And this is the changes in the watershed from 1992 to 2017. You can see how much wetlands we lost, and you can see how much upland forests that we've lost. It was an 18% decrease in upland forests. And this is the distribution and the loss of those forests. It's about 20% of the watershed is forested now, and that's pretty low. All that has an effect on water quality. We're losing forests far from streams and waterways. As you can see here, this is a recent photo. I think it's near Millsboro. And we're losing forest right on the waterways. This is from White Creek. I think this is in Doug's neck of the woods. But on average, when you, a preliminary land use application in Sussex County, on average, 51% of the forest on the development parcel is slated for clearing. On average, half of it. And it really adds up. 2017 to 2019, 2 square miles of forest that were intended for clearing.
Chris, can you estimate the distance from the water's edge to the silt fence?
That's a few feet. I don't know,
I
maybe.
think that's 25 feet.
I think it'd probably be less than that. It's not far. Where building is occurring, it's throughout, but it is also in flood-prone areas. There was a study from Climate Central in 2019 that looked at where building was occurring, and they found that from 2010 to 2017, Sussex County had the 3rd highest number of homes built in the 10-year flood risk zone of any ocean coastal county in the U.S. And so what's a 10-year flood year zone? Well, that's where floods are projected to happen on a 10-year interval in 2050 under sea level rise projections. And, we see it. Flooding this is Sussex County, right? This is Long Neck. This is sunny day flooding. And we are just kind of grappling with that now because this didn't happen so much before. I mean, occasionally it would happen, but it's happening more frequently. And all this water is taking stuff off the land, trash and fertilizers, and it's pulling stuff into the bay after it goes out. We're not sure how much pollution that is causing. But buffers can help with that. Buffers can help with the flooding, keeping people out the water. So now I'm going to shift again to talk about our wetlands. How are they doing? We know wetlands are very important. Sussex has almost half of the state's wetlands. We know that they protect our drinking water, our streams. They filter pollutants from the bays. They have tremendous capacity to mitigate loss from storm surge. There was a study of East Coast wetlands recently that over $500 million in direct flood damages were estimated to be mitigated by wetlands from Hurricane Sandy. They provide biodiversity, and almost half of wetland plant species in Delaware are rare. Wetlands are really important, and that's why we're doing this buffer ordinance. They add up to a lot of economic value, and the University of Delaware has found that total statewide wetlands provide $1 to $3 billion in annual economic activity. Our salt marshes are very important for the estuary, and we've lost a lot of them. We lost over 3,000 acres since the late 30s. But the good thing about this trend is you can see it really slowed down, basically stopped. The direct loss of salt marshes has stopped, and that was due to the Delaware's Wetland Act in the 70s that stopped the loss of the marshes. However, we are now losing marshes to sea level rise. Not direct impact, but indirect impacts. This is a healthy looking marsh, right? See how it's contiguous? It's not pockmarked with holes or anything. This is not a healthy marsh. This is a marsh that's disappearing. These are the marshes in Little Asselman Bay. And our marshes are going away down there, and so do the services they provide: filtration, flood control, habitat. And we've been able to measure this type of degradation. The interiors of the marshes are collapsing because of sea level rise. It's happening in other areas, but it's really pronounced in Little Asselman Bay. And so the only way that these wetlands can now maintain themselves is they migrate inland with sea level rise, very slowly, but they do move inland. So buffers allow them a place to migrate into.
That's cumulative, or is that year to year?
That is cumulative.
Okay.
Thank you. Good clarification. There's been work by University of Delaware that's actually measured the rates of wetland migration, and it really depends on what the upland looks like next to the wetland. If it's a really shallow sloping upland, the wetlands can move very fast, 5 to 6 feet a year. If it's a steep slope, the wetlands don't move very fast. They don't have very far to go, so they move much slower. So that's why the center recommends, in some cases, very wide buffers on tidal wetlands to allow that migration to happen. To sum up the importance of wetlands and why we're doing this ordinance is this picture I took during a nor'easter on Indian River Bay. You can see there's not even that much fetch here across the water, but the power of that storm is whipping up those waves on the Indian River Bay. And that green line shows where the wetland starts. And look how calm the water is. They have an amazing capacity to mitigate that storm surge. They protect us. They protect our properties. And that's why we're doing this ordinance, and we're looking to improve the buffers that protect the wetlands. So I would like to switch now into what I believe the ordinance achieves. We've talked a lot about the consensus points of the work group. We support that. There are a few exceptions, little things that I want to talk about, but I think the most important thing are the purposes of the buffer are very well defined. It requires a management plan. That's great. Really makes clear how they should be maintained. Exclude lot lines from the buffer, addresses invasive species, which is a real concern in developing areas, and includes access to features through an easement, which is a very forward-looking part of this ordinance. A lot of achievements. So the work group did a really great job on this, and staff really helped to support that. So I want to take a moment again to focus on the purposes of the ordinance. Very important. The first purpose is to improve/protect water quality. The second is to provide wildlife habitat via nesting, breeding, and feeding opportunities, provide sanctuary and refuge during high water events, and protect critical habitat. protect threatened and endangered species. What are we talking about? Turtles, egrets, herons, otters, frogs, salamanders, bats. This is the wildlife that we're talking about. They need this habitat to survive. And then to enhance flood storage. There's a tendency when we're working with natural resources to focus on one of the functions. It's a natural tendency. But I encourage you to take the holistic approach that this ordinance was built on when considering what is in the ordinance. And look at all of the functions. If we focus on one, we often lose the others. We've got to focus on all of these purposes. So we're going to move on to buffer widths. The wider the buffers are, the more functional they are, but that's to a point. Minimum widths matter. And an example of that is if you got a buffer on a salt marsh and it's providing physical buffering from human activities, and maybe what that does is that protects a sensitive marsh bird who's trying to raise the little marsh babies, right? Some marsh birds are very sensitive and they can't take human disturbance. They don't like to see people. They'll leave the area. So if you've got one house that's on a very narrow buffer, or maybe no buffer, and it's like right on the marsh, then that large area of marsh can be compromised by that one narrow part of the buffer. That's an example of how minimum buffer width matters. Streamside buffers, the width recommendation is pretty clear. Over and over, the science recommends 100 feet. And this is an example, a recent example of that recommendation from the Journal of the American Water Resources Association, a very large analysis of other studies, and they came up with, to protect the biotic integrity of the stream, 100 feet. It's very common. You see that a lot. So I'd like to show you how the proposed ordinance stacks up to the scientific recommendations, and also what other jurisdictions are doing nearby. Up top is what the center recommends. That was one of the things we included in the email yesterday. We put together a pretty comprehensive study of the science in 2008. So the minimum requirement is in dark blue, the maximum requirement is in light blue, and this is for tidal, wetlands, and waters, and we're talking buffer widths here. Current, we're at 50 feet for Sussex, and what is proposed is a minimum width of 100 feet. So it's less than New Jersey, but it's the same as Maryland, Kent, Newcastle. So doing a pretty good job there on tidal, wetlands, and buffers. Very, very commensurate. Perennial streams and buffers. New Jersey has 300 feet. Maryland critical areas has from 100 to 300. We recommend 80 to 150. Newcastle has 100. Kent 100. Sussex current is 50. As proposed, it remains at 50. That's about half of the other two counties. Now, when you take a look at how these minimum buffer widths change, when you put buffer width averaging in there, you see it's a little bit of a different story. The minimum width can go down to 50. It stacks up a little bit differently when you consider buffer width averaging. The question comes up often, do other jurisdictions allow buffer width averaging? And these other jurisdictions do not allow that. New Jersey allows some, in some cases, a little bit of buffer width averaging. Now this kind of sums it up. If you take the average minimum buffer widths across the resource types, across those other jurisdictions, the average comes out to 116 for the other jurisdictions. Sussex without averaging is 53, and Sussex with averaging is 26. That's about as distilled as I can get. Okay, so the vegetation is also a very important. Yes, John?
Get back to the last slide. You're saying Sussex with averaging is 26. Does that take into consideration the whatever's preserved across the stream or
Thank you for that clarification.
Or
Thank you for that. You're on to it. And the note there says it does not include the options in that averaging. If you add the options in that averaging, who knows what you're going to get. This is just with the buffer averaging. Thank you, John, for pointing that out. On to vegetation, another very important part of a buffer ordinance. This just shows the type of vegetation that's required. Right now, we require natural vegetation. Natural vegetation in Sussex, if you don't cultivate it and you let it go, in 99% of the uplands, you get a forest. It's eventually going to grow up to a forest. That's what natural vegetation is. It says it's established in natural vegetation in the current ordinance. That has been interpreted a lot of different ways. In the proposed ordinance, the problem that we're talking about today is the forest. That's what the discussion has been about. How do we protect that forest? And it is a difficult thing to do. And how most other jurisdictions have dealt with that is say, well, if there's no forest there, when you put your application in, then you got to replant it. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So here are a review of the requested amendments to the ordinance. The first is a requirement for protecting and restoring the forest in the resource buffer standards. This, I believe, solves much of the problems that led to the inclusion of the really problematic Section G. Second is the removal of Section G, and then clarifying maintenance and drainage conveyance, and then we're talking about adding enforcement specifically to the ordinance. Why forests? I think here's a statement that really sums this up. This is from the Chesapeake Bay Executive Council, which is the governors of the Chesapeake Bay watershed states and the EPA administrator. Forests are the most beneficial land use for protecting water quality due to their ability to capture, filter, and retain water, as well as pollution from the air. Forests are essential to providing clean water to over 10 million residents. They provide valuable ecological services and economic benefits, flood control, wildlife habitat, and forest products. That's why forests. Forests provide better water quality protection than do grass buffers. They remove 36% more nitrogen on average, and that nitrogen is stored in the wood that you see above ground, but also in the roots and the soil organic matter that you see below ground. Above is an example of a grassed buffer in the photo above, and this is an example of the forested buffer in the photo below. Forests also, for streams, allow the stream itself to process nutrients better. There is reduction of nitrogen in those stream channels, and forests enhance that. They also support the wildlife habitat. There's not much wildlife habitat going on in that top grass buffer there.
How wide is the typical root zone for a large tree?
Gosh, what is it, 35 feet? Something
35.
like that. You know, and that's probably the big roots. But if you think about a 100-year white oak, you know, my goodness.
They got to have all their roots
Right.
to survive.
Yep. So a forest isn't just a canopy tree. Forests have structure, and that's what this diagram shows. It's not just canopy trees, but it's the saplings, the understory, the shrubs, the leaf litter on the bottom, and all those add to the function of the buffer. They are all niches for wildlife, and they all stop precipitation, they control flooding, and they store nutrients. The science has shown that the amount of forest in an estuary's watershed, particularly near the water, has significant positive influence on the estuary's bay grasses, crabs, and marsh birds. It's the forest. And this is a great example of a forested buffer. It shows those layers. There's the canopy trees. You can see the sub-canopy trees, the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, and it's beautiful. It is beautiful. And they have a view out onto the water, and they got the bay grasses growing into the water right there. So this is a great example. So what we are recommending is to eliminate the non-forested buffer option and require forests in the buffer. If they're there, they are preserved. And if they are not there at the time of application, then they have to have a planting plan for how they're going to bring them back. And it's not easy to restore a forest. There is a cost associated with that. And that is the incentive for the landowner to keep the forest. It's still their choice how they manage their forest before they submit the application, but they have the knowledge that they have to plant it back if they don't have a forest there. And that's what the other jurisdictions do. And it seems to work pretty good. And in most cases, the forests are probably there anyway. Now, you might say, well, couldn't a forest kind of just come back naturally? You know, do you have to plant it? Couldn't it come back naturally? And yes, they can, And so in this recommendation that we provide you is the allowance for natural revegetation of the forest in the buffer when it is near a mature native forest. So you get the seed bank there that can restore the forest itself. That solves the problem of having to go back and say, all right, how are we going to keep the forest? How are we going to get these folks to hang on to the forest? You simply require it. You just require it, and you set the bar. So the resource buffer options descriptions, man, I've read code, and this is a very confusing piece of code. It is a very long piece of code. It took me 5 times reading this code to understand it. It was very, very difficult to understand. But I think I boiled it down a little bit. If you retain forest in a buffer, it allows the reduction of the buffer width by half. We can't support any reductions of buffer width. That doesn't make sense in terms of the purpose of the ordinance. It just doesn't make sense. Because the buffers are designed to be on the development. They are designed to protect the wetlands and waters from the impacts of the development. Retaining forest in a buffer allows reduction of the development perimeter buffer. I'm calling it a development perimeter buffer. It's actually called the forested landscape buffer. But it's the buffer that goes around the development, right? So it's like the buffer from your neighbors. It's the buffer to keep good neighbors, right? But these options allow the removal of that buffer. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? Okay. So I want to show you some examples. I think a lot of people have examples of what this looks like, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do a better job than Vince and Hans or not. But let me orient you and do my best here. On the left, you see the developing property. You got the tidal water up there in blue. Now, on the right is an existing development, okay? And it has a 50-foot buffer that was required under the code that we got today. They kept it. Nice forest. Now, what is being proposed is that we have a 100-foot forested buffer on tidal water. That's what's being proposed. Option 1, and this is the perimeter buffer between the development there. Option 1 says when preservation of a forest within the resource buffer is in existence for at least 5 years, then a corresponding area reduction of buffer zone B, which is 50 foot on this one, is allowed. So the forest is there. Well, now you got a 50-foot buffer. That's just what you got in current code today. Or if you want, you can keep that and then you can take out the property perimeter buffer. And that obviously causes problems. But it doesn't gain much. Option 1B is if there is a natural forest connected to but not within the resource buffer in excess of the requirements, then a corresponding area reduction of either the non-forest resource zone buffer B on the same resource or the forest or landscape buffer B in areas is permitted. So you lose that buffer because you got that. The problem with that is that the area that is protected there, it's not within the buffer, it's not doing very much for water quality, so it's not functionally equivalent to the buffer that is lost. We want to maintain functional equivalence when we're doing this stuff. Or, if you want, you can take out the perimeter buffer. Here's another option that you can do. You got a 100-foot buffer there, and if you add another, let's say, 20 foot onto that of non-forested buffer, then you can take out the perimeter buffer. I'm not sure how that makes sense, frankly. I don't know what that adds. I'm still trying to figure it out. And when you take out the perimeter buffer, you add the houses, and now, can you imagine what the neighbors are going to say? Where did our buffer go? And one thing to point out about this, I don't think homeowners associations at large in the watershed understand that this is an option. This is a big policy change, and I don't think folks are aware of it. Because it's in a water quality buffer ordinance.
Chris, on your map,
Yeah.
that blue line that runs to the left of the houses,
Yeah.
that's a stream.
No, I'm sorry, it's not.
Okay.
It is a buffer that is, it's the forested landscape buffer from a different part of the code, and it's meant to provide a physical buffer between like developments.
The previous slide you were showing, that blue line is simply a delineation of the property line.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, you're
Okay,
correct.
It's not water.
No, it's not. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so now there's another set of options when you can create these off-site buffers for a conservation easement. Then you can have a 75% corresponding reduction in buffer zones A or B. And so I just want to show you what that could look like. So you do a conservation easement somewhere, and that's what you can do. You can take out 75% of that buffer in its entirety. No buffer for a large part of it. So the houses go right up on the water. You got no protection, much less protection than you have in the current ordinance. And I want to go back to my original slide on Love Creek. What will the residents in the area say when those houses...
You're sure that that's an option?
I mean, this is how it's written, right?
Do you agree that that's an option?
As far as the removal of the perimeter.
Is that a possibility? Could that happen?
Explain it to me again, how you've drawn it up.
So it says, when the creation of an off-site resource buffer is protected under a perpetual conservation easement, so that's somewhere else, right?
Right.
Then a 75% corresponding area reduction of the resource buffer zones A and B, so that's the total buffer, is the same in the same resource within the development, so title for title. The upland, that's what you can do.
It's 75% of the amount that you protected off-site would then be applied against the A or B.
So who would determine if the amount you're protecting off-site was a valuable enough resource to allow this to happen? I mean, it would have to be, in my mind, a really good trade,
No, understood. I mean, that would be something that would be determined by the Planning and Zoning Commission when it goes through site plan approval.
You still have a big chunk of coastline there or waterway that's completely unbuffered.
But it wouldn't be unbuffered because you wouldn't be able to get it down to zero, and you'd be picking up land somewhere else off-site too.
So what would it be in this scenario?
25 feet.
Yeah.
75?
25.
Because there's a housing development down in my creek, in my district off Route 54, that their lawns go right into the creek. I mean, literally. I mean, and that's what that picture looks like.
Well, I think in this, how it's written, and I honestly, I don't think it's worth trying to fix this section. But the way that I read it after reading it 5 times, it says a 75% corresponding area reduction, area, not width, of the resource buffer zones A and B. Area, not width. So let's move on. I think I hope my point
I want
is...
to be sure about this one because that's problematic in my mind.
So now these options have to occur within the same watersheds. They're called HUC 12 watersheds, and I want to illustrate for you so that you can understand what that is. These are the HUC 12 watersheds in the eastern part of the county here. Within every green watershed there, you can operate and you can do this stuff. And the idea is to try to keep the impacts and the options in the same areas. And from this scale, it doesn't look too bad. You say, okay, well, maybe that works. But then let's take a look at as an example here on Indian River. Now you can do a development project up here near Lingo Point, right on this creek. And then you can do your conservation easement down on Island Creek. So 2 different creeks. So the impacts to the one creek are being, I guess, mitigated to the impacts with a conservation on another creek. The buffers on that creek up there are needed to protect that creek. So that's where it kind of becomes problematic. Here are some examples. I'm going to do my best to try to show, like on the ground, what some of this looks like. For example, option 2AI. You can protect a portion of non-forested buffer and then reduce an equal amount of forested buffer on a neighboring property or a property within that watershed. And in red is the area buffer that you can reduce for protecting the buffer on the other property. So another option that you have, you can, gosh, I can't remember exactly the words here, but you can protect an area of forested buffer on one property and exchange it for the area of forested buffer on another property. So you can go cut down the woods in this buffer here. And that doesn't make sense because that's a very well-functioning buffer. Why would you want to cut that down? Why would you want to give that away? And that's what that buffer looks like from the air. It's doing a great job. It needs to be protected. It shouldn't be traded away. Some other problems are, how do you know that that buffer that you are preserving wouldn't already be preserved? How do you prove the concept of additionality, which is a real challenge for a lot of these offsets? How do you convince the public that this is a good idea? Okay. So my argument here is I think as a work group we achieved design flexibility through buffer width averaging. And I think if you protect the forest, then you don't need this resource or the options. And we just need to cut the whole section, keep it simple. We should never reduce the width of the buffers. And incentives, if they're provided, they should be provided to increase the buffer width of what the bar is raised to. So just a real quick clarification on maintenance drainage. This is section F2. The idea here is to assess streams for any potential blockages. I think that's a good idea. Support that. The location of any stream blockages, such as debris dams, fallen or unstable trees, beaver dams, or similar impediments to conveyance. Because many of these same potential blockages to conveyance are also important and natural parts of a stream that support their function to improve water quality and provide habitat, we are requesting language that clarifies that they should be removed if they have a high likelihood of causing flooding, resulting in damage to property or infrastructure. This is just a clarifying thing that says you don't go in and take out every tree that's leaning over because those trees have values. It's just to set some clarification on the ordinance. Also, I think positive conveyance needs to be defined so it's more clear for the developer on what needs to be done when they submit their plan. Final request is for stormwater features in the buffer. This is the one activity that did have some problem with. I don't think that stormwater detention and the stormwater dry ponds and wet ponds belong in a buffer because they don't meet the purposes of the ordinance. They provide some flood control, they provide some limited nutrient removal, but this is an example on Love Creek, and it is providing no habitat. No habitat.
That wouldn't happen today, would it? Good?
I mean, that is in the ground.
That was approved some time ago, right?
Yes. The current proposed regulation.
Because I think this chart says, and I asked the question earlier, could retention ponds be permitted in zone A or B? And they said no. It's
For the record,
under 18 under table 2.
For the record, the table allows conveyance. That is a practice. That is not allowed.
Just one thing, just for clarification on it. It's a good picture graphically, because Mr. Riley and I had this conversation about this particular project. This one was a pre-developed piece of ground. The docking marina was there for years. There were greenhouses. There was actually cabins on that side. There's a bunch of stuff that was there over there. So it didn't come in as an undeveloped piece of property, and it's actually in the Marine District, and it wasn't a subdivision. So there's all. This one shows, I think, graphically what we're talking about, but approval-wise, it's in its sort of own category.
And the table says it's not allowed. So it's
If I I have misread that table,
It says
then,
conveyance.
okay, if I misread that table,
Which means flow from A to B.
completely apologize. Understood that this was a pre-developed site,
That's fine, I just want to be clear that,
Yeah.
we're all in agreement on what it
Yeah.
does say.
and I'll take a look at that because I swore, but I probably misread it, and for that, I apologize. So final request is for provisions on enforcement. I think back to my original point, in most cases, the buffers are put in well, the forests are preserved, but there have been a lot of cases where that hasn't been the case, and that the buffers get torn down. Just a few examples for various reasons how that happened. This is actually in the town of Ocean View here, but you see how the detrimental impacts that can happen. This was a forest right on this little stream right here, and a lot of sediment came in, ended up turning White Creek all like chocolate milk, and one of the reasons why they got to dredge it. And then this is a recent site here on Angola, and there are a number of cases where it just would really help to have very clear enforcement provisions with penalties so that folks know what will be required.
How old is this picture?
This is just the other month. I mean, this is a couple months ago.
So this home potentially is not even occupied yet?
Correct, yeah. And then, I don't know the particulars of this one, but the edge of that silt fence right there is basically, I think, the wetland line from my experience.
So this should not have happened.
In my opinion, no.
Does anybody, Todd, should not have happened?
That's correct. It should not have happened.
So what's our recourse?
So this is a old subdivision, meaning it falls under the current ordinance related to both our standards and our 50-foot for title. And when I say standards, our subdivision standards. And you see the current house that's green, but you see the other houses past that. Those are also built on the same general line, which was not picked up in our plan review process. So eventually it did get through, and once it got through the review process out on site, it was built to plan, and it was missed.
So and at this point, there is no recourse.
No. In this example.
Because it was approved.
Correct.
So I just want to wrap up my testimony by again thanking the council. And I know I was critical a lot of the areas of the ordinance. I want to reinforce just how great I think a lot of the parts of the ordinance are and the process to develop them. I think the areas that need fixed were done with good intentions, and I think the fix that I've presented will clear up these problems. And I think we've got a wonderful opportunity in front of us for water quality and wildlife and really our way of life in Sussex County. So thank you for the opportunity and your attention.
Thank you.